winter of 1943, inside a sprawling hospital complex in occupied Belgium, a group of Catholic nuns committed what the Gestapo would later classify as high treason. These were not spies trained in the dark arts of espionage, nor resistance fighters hardened by years of guerrilla warfare. They were women of God, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, who had spent their lives healing the sick and comforting the dying. Yet on frozen December nights, while Nazi officers slept soundly in commandeered rooms just floors above, these same nuns crept through dimly lit corridors with armfuls of stolen hospital linens, transforming bedsheets into instruments of liberation. The penalty for such an act was execution by firing squad, a fate the SS had already demonstrated with terrifying efficiency across occupied Europe. But what the Nazis never anticipated was that the very women they had forced to care for their wounded soldiers would become the architects of one of the most daring prisoner escape networks of World War II. The Saint-Pierre Hospital in Brussels had been seized by German forces in 1940, converted into a military facility where wounded Wehrmacht soldiers recovered alongside select political prisoners deemed valuable enough to keep alive. The original Belgian staff had been largely replaced, but the Nazi command made one critical miscalculation. They kept the nuns. After all, who better to provide round-the-clock care to change bandages and administer medications than women whose entire existence revolved around service and sacrifice? The Mother Superior, a woman named Sister Marguerite, appeared to the German administrators as the perfect collaborator. Meek and subservient, her face a mask of practiced humility whenever officers strode past. What they failed to recognize was that beneath her starched white habit beat the heart of a woman who had lost 2 brothers to Nazi labor camps and who recited her evening prayers not for forgiveness, but for the strength to do what was necessary. The hospital sat at the intersection of 2 worlds. On the upper floors, German officers recuperated in relative comfort, their rooms stocked with proper linens, hot meals, and the latest medical supplies shipped directly from Berlin. 3 floors below, in a section sealed off by iron gates and armed guards, sat a different kind of patient. These were members of the Belgian resistance, captured Allied airmen and political dissidents, men and women who had committed the crime of opposing the Third Reich. They were kept alive only because the Gestapo believed they possessed information worth extracting, and the interrogation rooms adjacent to their cells saw daily use. The nuns moved between these 2 realms like ghosts, their soft-soled shoes making no sound on the tile floors, their eyes downcast, their hands steady as they delivered meals and changed dressings. The guards grew so accustomed to their presence that they became invisible, just another fixture of the hospital landscape as unremarkable as the whitewashed walls. It began with a single bedsheet, stolen from the laundry room on a night when the regular guard had called in sick. Sister Marguerite had watched a resistance fighter die 2 days earlier, his body broken by torture, his final words a whispered plea to tell his family he had not betrayed them. Something fractured inside her that night, some final restraint that had kept her obedient and passive. She took the sheet, folded it carefully, and hid it beneath the altar cloth in the hospital chapel, where even the most zealous SS officer would not dare to search. Over the following weeks, more sheets disappeared, always in small numbers, never enough to trigger an inventory check. The nuns worked in absolute silence, their conspiracy unspoken but understood. Each woman who joined the network did so with full knowledge of the consequences, and each made her choice in the quiet solitude of prayer. The transformation of hospital linens into escape tools required ingenuity, born of desperation. In a storage room converted into a makeshift workshop, hidden behind stacks of medical supplies, the nuns braided strips of torn sheets into ropes strong enough to hold a man's weight. They tested their creations in the dead of night, lowering heavy bags of grain from upper windows to measure durability and stretch. Sister Agnes, who had spent her youth on a farm before taking her vows, remembered the rope-making techniques her father had taught her, twisting fibers in opposing directions to create tensile strength. The work was painstakingly slow, their fingers raw and bleeding from the repetitive motion, but they persisted. Each completed rope represented a potential life saved, a soul freed from the torture chambers below. By early 1944, the network had expanded beyond simple rope production. The nuns began mapping guard rotations, identifying blind spots in the security perimeter, and establishing communication channels with resistance cells outside the hospital walls. They smuggled messages in the hollow handles of mops, in the false bottoms of meal trays, in the rolled bandages they carried from room to room. The hospital that the Nazis believed they controlled had become a fortress of quiet rebellion, and at its heart stood women who had traded their rosaries for resistance. The question was no longer whether they would act, but when and how many lives they could save before the inevitable discovery that would bring the full weight of Nazi vengeance crashing down upon them. Belgium in 1940 was a nation suffocating under the iron grip of occupation, a country that had learned the bitter taste of defeat twice in a single generation. When German tanks rolled across the border in May of that year, they moved with such devastating speed that the Belgian army collapsed in 18 days, leaving the population stunned and helpless. King Leopold III surrendered unconditionally, a decision that would haunt the nation for decades, and within weeks the swastika flew over every government building from Antwerp to Brussels. The Nazis divided the country into administrative zones, installing a ruthless bureaucracy designed to extract every ounce of value from the conquered territory. Factories were retooled to produce weapons for the Reich, food supplies were seized and shipped to Germany, and any hint of resistance was met with public executions designed to terrorize the population into submission. For the citizens of Brussels, life became a daily negotiation with fear, a careful dance of appearing compliant while secretly harboring thoughts of defiance. The Saint-Pierre Hospital had served the people of Brussels for over 2 centuries, a sprawling complex of red brick buildings that occupied an entire city block near the historic center. Its halls had witnessed the birth of thousands, had comforted the dying, had stood as a sanctuary during plagues and wars. The nuns who ran the facility belonged to the Order of the Sisters of Charity, women who had dedicated their lives to the corporal works of mercy, chief among them caring for the sick and imprisoned. When the Wehrmacht arrived in June of 1940, they did so with requisition orders signed by the military governor himself. Half the hospital was to be converted immediately into a German military medical facility, with the remainder serving as a detention center for high-value prisoners awaiting interrogation or trial. The Mother Superior at the time, an elderly woman named Sister Beatrice, had protested directly to the German commandant, arguing that the hospital served the poorest citizens of Brussels, people who had nowhere else to turn. The commandant listened politely, then informed her that she had 24 hours to comply, or the entire nursing staff would be arrested and replaced with German personnel. Sister Marguerite watched this exchange from the doorway, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. She was 37 years old, younger than most of her sisters, a woman who had entered the convent at 19 after her fiancé died in a mining accident. She had chosen a life of service as penance for the anger she felt at God for taking the only man she had ever loved, channeling her rage into the back-breaking work of tending to the sick and forgotten. Now, standing in the corridor as German soldiers measured rooms and hung Nazi flags, she felt that old fury returning, sharp and hot and focused. The occupation transformed the hospital into something unrecognizable almost overnight. The upper floors became a recovery ward for wounded German soldiers, clean and well supplied, while the basement was converted into a makeshift prison with cells barely large enough to lie down in. Armed guards patrolled the corridors at all hours, their boots echoing on the tile floors, their presence a constant reminder of who held power. The first prisoner arrived on a Tuesday morning in July, dragged through the front entrance by 2 Gestapo agents, his face so badly beaten that Sister Marguerite initially thought he was dead. He was a university professor named Henri Dubois, arrested for distributing underground newspapers that encouraged resistance to German rule. The Gestapo had broken 3 of his ribs during interrogation, and he coughed blood into the thin mattress of his basement cell. Sister Marguerite was assigned to provide medical care to keep him alive long enough for further questioning, and as she cleaned his wounds with trembling hands, he whispered a single sentence that would change everything. He told her that the resistance was real, that thousands of Belgians were fighting back in secret, and that if she was brave enough, she could help. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and when she left his cell that evening, she knew with absolute certainty that neutrality was no longer an option. By the end of 1940, the hospital held 17 prisoners in its basement cells, men and women whose only crime was loving their country more than they feared death. The nuns moved among them like silent angels, bringing what comfort they could, sneaking extra portions of food when the guards were distracted, whispering words of encouragement in French and Flemish. Sister Marguerite began to recognize a pattern in the interrogations, the way certain prisoners were taken upstairs more frequently, the ones the Gestapo believed had valuable intelligence about resistance networks. She started keeping mental notes, memorizing names and details, and at night she prayed not for divine intervention, but for the courage to become the intervention herself. The winter of 1940 turned brutal, snow piling in the streets, and inside the hospital basement, prisoners shivered in cells without heat, their breath visible in the freezing air. It was then, watching a young woman die of pneumonia because the Germans refused to provide blankets to political detainees, that Sister Marguerite made her decision. She would not simply bear witness to this evil, she would fight it. The transformation from passive observer to active resistor did not happen in a single dramatic moment, but rather through a series of small, terrifying decisions that compounded over weeks and months. Sister Marguerite began by simply talking to the prisoners during her rounds, asking questions that went beyond their immediate medical needs. She learned their stories, memorized the names of their children, discovered which ones had connections to organized resistance cells and which were lone actors caught distributing pamphlets or sheltering fugitives. The guards paid no attention to these conversations, dismissing them as the empty chatter of a naive nun trying to bring spiritual comfort to the condemned. What they failed to understand was that each conversation was an intelligence-gathering operation, a careful mapping of who knew what, who could be trusted, and most importantly, who had people on the outside waiting for their return. Sister Marguerite kept no written records, understanding that a single discovered note could mean execution for everyone involved. Instead, she committed everything to memory, reciting names and details during her evening prayers until they became as familiar as scripture. The idea to steal hospital linens came not from Sister Marguerite, but from Sister Agnes, a 62-year-old nun who had worked in the hospital laundry for over 3 decades. She had noticed that the German supply officers conducted inventory checks on medical equipment and pharmaceuticals with obsessive precision, counting every syringe and morphine vial, but they paid almost no attention to mundane items like bedsheets and towels. The Wehrmacht assumed an endless supply of such basics, requisitioning new linens whenever stocks ran low, and the paperwork for these requests was handled by Belgian administrative staff who had learned to pad numbers and create phantom shortages. Sister Agnes brought her observation to Sister Marguerite during evening vespers, whispering it during a hymn when their voices were masked by the rest of the choir. The suggestion was simple but brilliant. If they could steal sheets in small quantities over time, they could accumulate enough material to create ropes without triggering any alarm. The German officers slept on fresh linens every night, never questioning where the old ones went, assuming they were laundered and returned to circulation. Recruiting other nuns into the conspiracy required a delicate balance of trust and deniability. Sister Marguerite could not simply announce the plan during a chapter meeting, could not risk even a single sister reporting the scheme to the German authorities out of fear or misguided loyalty. Instead, she approached each potential conspirator individually, usually in the chapel during private prayer when no guards were present. She would kneel beside them, head bowed, and speak in barely audible whispers, describing what she intended to do and asking if they would help. Some sisters declined immediately, their fear too overwhelming, and Sister Marguerite never held it against them, understanding that courage was not universally distributed, but others, particularly the younger nuns who had lost family members to the occupation, agreed without hesitation. Within 2 months, she had assembled a core group of 7 women, each assigned specific tasks. Sister Agnes controlled the laundry room, Sister Therese managed communication with prisoners, Sister Marie kept watch on guard rotations, Sister Catherine, the youngest at 24, had steady hands perfect for the intricate work of braiding rope. The first sheet disappeared on a cold November night in 1940, taken from a storage closet, while the night guard was distracted by a deliberately staged medical emergency on the third floor. Sister Therese had feigned a fall, crying out in pain, drawing both guards away from their posts for crucial minutes. Sister Agnes moved with practiced efficiency, folding the sheet into a tight bundle and hiding it beneath her habit, then walking calmly to the chapel, where she concealed it inside a wooden trunk that held old vestments no one had touched in years. The theft was so smooth, so unremarkable, that it set the template for everything that followed. Over the next 3 months, they stole 47 sheets, always in irregular intervals, never establishing a pattern that might be noticed. They varied their methods, sometimes taking linens from the German officers' quarters, sometimes from the general supply, occasionally even from the prisoners' cells, replacing stolen sheets with ones so worn and threadbare that no one questioned their disposal. The actual work of transforming hospital linens into escape ropes took place in a small storage room on the 4th floor, a space so filled with broken medical equipment and outdated supplies that even the meticulous Germans had given up trying to inventory it. The nuns cleared a small area in the back, hidden behind rusted surgical tables and stacks of pre-war record books, and there they worked in 2-hour shifts, always with one sister posted as lookout. Sister Catherine proved to be a natural, her fingers flying through the motions of tearing sheets into strips, braiding them together in patterns that created maximum tensile strength. They tested each rope obsessively, tying one end to a heavy radiator and pulling with all their combined weight, searching for weak points or signs of fraying. A rope that failed during an actual escape would mean not just a recaptured prisoner, but the certain exposure of their entire operation. By February of 1941, they had completed their first functional rope, 12 meters long, strong enough to support the weight of a grown man, indistinguishable from professional climbing equipment, except for the faint floral pattern still visible on some of the braided strips. The challenge of creating escape ropes was only half the equation. The other half, infinitely more complex, was establishing contact with the resistance networks operating in the shadows of occupied Brussels. Sister Marguerite understood that a rope without a destination was useless, that freed prisoners needed safe houses, forged papers, and underground railways to spirit them out of the city before the Gestapo could organize a manhunt. The problem was that the nuns lived in almost complete isolation, their movements restricted to the hospital grounds, their conversations monitored by guards who understood enough French to catch suspicious phrases. The resistance cells operating in Brussels were deliberately fragmented, structured so that no single member knew more than a handful of contacts, a security measure designed to prevent the entire network from collapsing if someone was captured and tortured. Sister Marguerite needed to bridge this gap, to somehow signal to the outside world that the hospital was no longer simply a place of German control, but a potential liberation point. The breakthrough came through the hospital's delivery system, specifically through a baker named Jean-Paul Mercier, who brought bread to the facility 3 times a week. He was a small man in his 50s, perpetually covered in flour dust, who had been making the same deliveries for 15 years. The German guards barely glanced at him anymore, waving him through the checkpoints with the bored indifference of soldiers performing routine duty. What they did not know was that Jean-Paul's eldest son had been executed by firing squad in 1940 for sabotaging a railway line, and that the baker had spent every day since plotting ways to hurt the occupation. Sister Marguerite noticed something during one of his deliveries, the way his eyes lingered on the basement entrance where prisoners were held, the tightness around his mouth, when German officers walked past. She made a calculated gamble, slipping a note into an empty bread basket as he prepared to leave. A note written in careful script that read simply, "We want to help. Can you connect us?" She spent the next 3 days in agonizing uncertainty, terrifying herself with visions of Jean-Paul turning the note over to the Gestapo, of armed soldiers storming the chapel at dawn. The baker's response came a week later, hidden inside a loaf of dark rye bread that he personally handed to Sister Marguerite, with a barely perceptible nod. She waited until she was alone in the pantry before breaking the loaf open, finding a tightly rolled strip of paper baked into the center. The message was brief and unsigned. Sunday confessional, 3 in the afternoon. The hospital had a small chapel that remained open to the public, a concession the Germans had granted to maintain an appearance of religious tolerance, and on Sunday afternoons a priest from a nearby parish came to hear confessions. Sister Marguerite arrived at the appointed time, kneeling in the confessional booth, and when the partition slid open, she found herself speaking not to the familiar voice of Father Thomas, but to someone younger, harder. The man identified himself only as Michel, explained that Jean-Paul had vouched for her, and asked a single direct question: what exactly could the nuns provide? Sister Marguerite described their operation, the stolen linens, the completed ropes, the access they had to prisoner cells. There was a long silence, and then Michel laid out what would be required for an actual escape to succeed. The resistance had safe houses scattered throughout Brussels, apartments and basements, where fugitives could hide for days or weeks until forged papers were prepared and transportation arranged. They had contacts in the railway system who could smuggle people onto freight trains heading toward unoccupied France or neutral Switzerland. What they lacked was access to the prisoners themselves, particularly the high-value detainees, held in heavily guarded facilities like Saint-Pierre Hospital. Michel explained that the Gestapo was extremely efficient at tracking escapees, that simply freeing someone from a cell was meaningless if they were recaptured within hours. The escape had to be coordinated with precision. The prisoner handed off to a resistance contact within minutes of leaving the hospital grounds, moved immediately to a safe house before the alarm could be raised. Sister Marguerite would need to provide advance notice of which prisoner was being freed and exactly when, giving the resistance time to position people and prepare the extraction route. Michel made it clear that the risk was extraordinary, that a single mistake would result in mass arrests and executions, and he gave Sister Marguerite one final chance to walk away. She did not walk away. Instead, she asked Michel how soon they could attempt the first escape, and when he suggested waiting several months to plan meticulously, she shook her head firmly. There was a prisoner in the basement, a resistance fighter named Edward Janssens, who had been under interrogation for 6 weeks, and Sister Marguerite had overheard 2 Gestapo officers discussing his scheduled execution in 10 days. If they were going to save anyone, it had to be him, and it had to be soon, and it. Michel studied her through the confessional screen, this nun who spoke with such quiet certainty about defying the Third Reich, and after a moment he agreed. They would attempt the escape in 1 week, on a Tuesday night, when guard shifts changed and there was a brief window of reduced surveillance. Sister Marguerite left the confessional with her hands shaking, but her resolve absolute, knowing that she had just committed herself and her fellow nuns to an act that would either save a life or end all of theirs. The week leading up to Edward Janssens' escape was a masterclass in controlled terror, 7 days during which Sister Marguerite and her conspirators moved through their routines with forced normalcy, while every nerve screamed with anticipation. They could not afford even the slightest deviation from their established patterns, could not risk a single guard noticing unusual behavior or asking uncomfortable questions. Sister Marguerite continued her medical rounds with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed for years, changing bandages and dispensing medications, her face a mask of serene devotion even as her mind raced through contingencies and failure scenarios. She visited Edward's cell daily, ostensibly to treat the injuries inflicted during his interrogations, and during these visits she whispered fragments of the plan in rapid French, never speaking long enough to attract attention. Edward himself was a broken man physically, his left arm fractured in 2 places, his ribs bruised purple from systematic beatings, but his eyes retained a fierce intelligence that told Sister Marguerite he understood exactly what was being asked of him and was willing to risk everything for one chance at freedom. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its dependence on perfect timing. Tuesday night saw a shift change at 10 in the evening, when the day guards were replaced by a smaller night crew that patrolled in predictable patterns. There was a 15-minute window during the transition when the basement cells were monitored by only a single guard, an older Wehrmacht corporal named Schneider, who had developed the habit of taking his break in the ground-floor guardroom to smoke and drink coffee. Sister Therese had observed this pattern for months, noting that Schneider was remarkably consistent, arriving at the guardroom at precisely 10:12 and remaining there until 10:27. During those 15 minutes, the basement corridor would be unwatched, and Edouard's cell door, which Sister Agnes had secretly damaged weeks earlier so the lock no longer fully engaged, could be opened from the inside with sufficient force. The escape route led from the basement up a rarely used service stairwell to the 4th floor, then across to a window that faced a narrow alley behind the hospital. The rope would be anchored to a radiator bolted into the wall, and Edouard would descend 4 stories into the alley, where Michel and 2 other resistance members would be waiting with civilian clothes and forged identity papers. Sister Catherine spent the final 2 days reinforcing the escape rope, adding extra braiding to the sections that would bear the most strain, testing and retesting the knots that would secure it to the radiator. She worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession, understanding that this rope represented not just strips of stolen linen, but a human life hanging in the balance. The completed rope measured exactly 14 meters, longer than necessary, but providing a safety margin in case Edouard needed to stop his descent or adjust his position. They smuggled it to the 4th floor hidden inside a laundry cart, concealing it behind the same broken medical equipment that had sheltered their workshop, and Sister Marie spent an entire afternoon ensuring the chosen window could be opened silently, oiling the hinges with grease stolen from the hospital kitchen until they moved without the slightest squeak. The Resistance's role was equally critical and far more dangerous. Michel had assembled a 3-person extraction team that would position themselves in the alley at exactly 10:15, giving them a 12-minute window to receive Edward, change his clothes, and move him 3 blocks to a bakery basement that served as the first safe house. They had mapped multiple escape routes from the alley, identifying which streets were patrolled by German soldiers and which remained dark and relatively unwatched. The forged papers identified Edouard as a factory worker from Antwerp, complete with work permits and ration cards that would withstand casual inspection. Michel had even arranged for a sympathetic doctor to provide legitimate medical documentation explaining Edouard's injuries as the result of a factory accident, a cover story that would hold up if they were stopped at a checkpoint. The level of coordination required was staggering. Dozens of moving parts that all had to function flawlessly, and the consequences of failure were explicit. If Edouard was recaptured, the Gestapo would torture him until he revealed how he escaped, and every person involved would face execution. Sister Marguerite gathered her core group in the chapel on Monday evening, the night before the escape attempt, and for the first time since the conspiracy began, she allowed herself to speak plainly about what they were doing and what it meant. She reminded them that they could still withdraw, that no one would judge them for choosing safety over resistance, but as she looked at each woman's face in the flickering candlelight, she saw only determination. Sister Agnes, who had lost a grandson to a German bombing raid, Sister Therese, whose brother was imprisoned in a labor camp, Sister Catherine, who had watched too many prisoners die in the basement cells, Sister Marie, who simply could not reconcile her faith in a loving God with passive acceptance of evil. They prayed together, not for success, but for courage, and when they left the chapel, each woman carried the weight of what Tuesday night would demand. The die was cast, the plan in motion, and there was no turning back. Tuesday arrived with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like pulled taffy, as Sister Marguerite moved through her duties with mechanical precision. She distributed breakfast to the prisoners at 6 in the morning, her hands steady as she slid trays through the cell door slots, but when she reached Edouard's cell, she allowed herself the briefest moment of eye contact, a silent acknowledgement of what the coming night would bring. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and she saw in his bruised face a mixture of hope and terror that mirrored her own churning emotions. The day proceeded with excruciating normalcy, German officers striding through corridors barking orders, wounded soldiers calling for pain medication. The endless routine of institutional life grinding forward, oblivious to the conspiracy taking shape in its shadows. Sister Marguerite forced herself to eat lunch, even though her stomach twisted with anxiety, knowing she would need her strength for the long night ahead. She attended afternoon prayers with the other nuns, her lips moving through familiar Latin verses, while her mind rehearsed the plan for the 1000th time, searching for flaws or oversights that could doom them all. The shift change began at 9:45, when the day guards started their end-of-shift routines, filling out paperwork and preparing to hand over duties to the night crew. Sister Marie positioned herself near the basement entrance, pretending to organize medical supplies while actually monitoring the guard movements with peripheral vision. She counted 6 guards total during the transition period, a larger number than usual, and for a heart-stopping moment she wondered if somehow the plan had been discovered, if the increased security was a trap waiting to spring. But then she recognized one of the extra guards as a replacement for someone out sick, a routine substitution that happened occasionally, and her breathing steadied. At precisely 10:07, Corporal Schneider emerged from the basement stairwell, his rifle slung over his shoulder, already reaching into his breast pocket for his cigarettes. He exchanged brief words with the incoming night supervisor, then headed toward the ground-floor guardroom, his boots echoing down the hallway in a rhythm Sister Marie had memorized through months of observation. Sister Marguerite waited in the 4th-floor storage room, the escape rope coiled at her feet like a sleeping serpent. Sister Catherine beside her with hands clasped in prayer. They had chosen this location because it offered a clear view of the alley below, allowing them to confirm the presence of the resistance extraction team before committing to the escape. At 10:13, Sister Marguerite pressed her face against the window glass, searching the darkness, and felt her heart sink when she saw nothing but empty shadows. Had something gone wrong? Had Michel been arrested? But then a match flared briefly in a doorway across the alley, the predetermined signal, and she spotted 3 figures pressed against the wall, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The extraction team was in position. Sister Marguerite turned to Sister Catherine and whispered a single word: "Go." Sister Catherine slipped from the storage room and descended the service stairwell with practiced silence, her mission to unlock Edward's cell and guide him up 4 floors to the escape window. The next 8 minutes were the longest of Sister Marguerite's life. She stood at the window, the rope in her hands, every muscle tensed for action while simultaneously straining to hear any sound that might indicate discovery. The hospital around her continued its nightly routine, the murmur of voices from patient rooms, the squeak of a medication cart being pushed down a distant corridor, the periodic cough of a wounded German soldier. Normal sounds that felt surreal given what was happening in the building's depths. At 10:19, she heard footsteps on the service stairwell, 2 sets moving quickly but not running, and then Sister Catherine appeared with Edward behind her, the prisoner moving with visible pain, one arm cradled against his chest, his breathing labored from the climb. He looked at Sister Marguerite with an expression of such raw gratitude that she had to look away, focusing instead on securing the rope to the radiator with the special knot Sister Agnes had taught her, a sailor's knot that would hold under tremendous strain, but could be released quickly afterward to retrieve the rope and eliminate evidence. Edward approached the window as Sister Marguerite and Sister Catherine pushed it open, and the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of snow and coal smoke. Sister Marguerite handed him the rope, showing him how to wrap it around his body in a makeshift harness that would take pressure off his injured arm, and then she gripped his shoulder with surprising strength and spoke the only words she would say to him that night. She told him that God had not abandoned Belgium, that resistance lived in every shadow, and that he must survive to tell the world what was happening here. Edward climbed onto the windowsill, his legs trembling from weakness and fear, and for a terrible moment, Sister Marguerite thought he might be too injured to make the descent, that he would fall and break his neck in the alley below, rendering all their planning and risk meaningless. But then he gripped the rope with his good hand, wrapped it around his leg for additional support, and began lowering himself into the darkness, disappearing from view 1 agonizing meter at a time. Sister Marguerite leaned out the window, watching Edward's descent with her heart hammering so violently she could feel it in her throat. The rope moved in short, jerky increments as he lowered himself hand over hand, his injured arm making the process agonizingly slow. She could see his silhouette against the darker shadow of the building, a shape that seemed impossibly fragile and exposed, and every second that passed felt like an invitation for disaster. The alley below remained silent, the resistance team invisible in their positions, waiting for Edward to reach ground level before emerging to receive him. Sister Catherine stood beside her, one hand gripping the window frame so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her lips moving in silent prayer. The rope continued its descent, 3 meters down, then 4, then 5, and Sister Marguerite began to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hope. He was going to make it. They were actually going to pull this off. And then, from somewhere on the second floor, a door slammed with enough force to echo through the entire building, followed by the unmistakable sound of raised German voices and boots running on tile floors. The noise was not directed at them, some unrelated incident that had nothing to do with the escape, but in that moment of chaos, Edouard panicked. Sister Marguerite saw him jerk on the rope, saw him lose his grip for a heart-stopping instant before catching himself with his legs, and then he was sliding too fast, the rope burning through his makeshift harness, his controlled descent becoming a barely controlled fall. He hit the ground with a thud that Sister Marguerite heard clearly from 4 stories up, and she watched in horror as he crumpled to the cobblestones, his body motionless. The resistance team broke from their positions instantly, 2 men rushing to Edouard, while the third, Michel, scanned the surrounding windows for signs of German response. Sister Marguerite wanted to call down, to ask if Edouard was alive or dead, but she forced herself to remain silent, knowing that any sound could betray them all. The seconds stretched into an eternity, as the resistance members lifted Edouard between them, supporting his weight, and she saw with overwhelming relief that he was conscious, moving his legs, alive despite the fall. The extraction team melted into the shadows of the alley, moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of previous operations, previous escapes. They reached the end of the alley and turned onto a side street, disappearing from Sister Marguerite's view, and only then did she allow herself to breathe fully. Sister Catherine was already pulling the rope back up, hand over hand, the braided linen sliding through the window with a whisper of sound. They had perhaps 2 minutes before Corporal Schneider finished his break and returned to his patrol. 2 minutes to hide all evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Sister Marguerite helped coil the rope, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline flooding her system with nowhere to go. They shoved the rope behind the broken equipment, closed the window, and then descended the service stairwell separately, Sister Catherine going first, Sister Marguerite waiting 60 seconds before following, both women returning to their assigned duties as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The alarm went up at 10:38, 19 minutes after Edouard's cell was scheduled to be checked during the regular night patrol. Sister Marguerite was in the second-floor supply room when she heard the first shouts, German voices raised in anger and confusion, and then boots thundering through the corridors as guards rushed to the basement. She forced herself to continue organizing bandages, to maintain the appearance of routine work, even as her mind raced with calculations. 19 minutes. Edouard had a 19-minute head start before the Germans even knew he was missing. In a city the size of Brussels, with a resistance network ready to receive him, 19 minutes could be enough. It had to be enough. Within an hour, the entire hospital was locked down, every door sealed, every nun and staff member ordered to their quarters, while Gestapo officers conducted a building-wide search. They tore through rooms with methodical fury, overturning beds, emptying closets, interrogating anyone they encountered about suspicious activity. Sister Marguerite sat in the nuns' dormitory with her sisters, maintaining an expression of confused concern while Gestapo agents questioned them about the escape. Had they seen anything unusual? Had any prisoners spoken to them about escape plans? Had they noticed anyone accessing restricted areas? Each nun answered with carefully practiced responses, expressing shock that such a thing could happen, offering no useful information. The agents were particularly interested in the window, having discovered that Edouard must have exited the building somewhere above ground level, and they searched every floor methodically. When they reached the 4th-floor storage room, Sister Marguerite felt her breath catch, certain they would find the rope, certain that everything would unravel. But the storage room was such a chaotic mess of discarded equipment, and the rope was hidden so thoroughly behind rusted surgical tables that the agents gave it only a cursory inspection before moving on. They never thought to look closely at the old hospital linens, never imagined that instruments of escape could be woven from something so mundane as bedsheets. By midnight, the search had yielded nothing. and the Gestapo commander stood in the hospital lobby, his face purple with rage, promising that someone would pay for this humiliation. The days following Eduard Janssen's escape were a masterclass in psychological warfare, as the Gestapo deployed every intimidation tactic in their arsenal to identify who had aided the prisoner. The hospital became a pressure cooker of suspicion and fear, with agents conducting repeated interrogations of the nursing staff, sometimes pulling the same nun aside 3 or 4 times in a single day to ask identical questions phrased in slightly different ways, searching for inconsistencies that might reveal deception. Sister Marguerite endured 6 separate interrogations, each conducted in a small office that had been converted into an improvised interrogation room, facing agents who alternated between friendly persuasion and barely veiled threats. They showed her photographs of executed resistance members, bodies hanging from lampposts with signs around their necks warning against treason. They promised leniency if she would simply tell them what she knew, anything at all that might help their investigation. Sister Marguerite met their questions with the same calm deflection every time, insisting she knew nothing, had seen nothing, understood nothing about how a prisoner could simply vanish from a locked cell in a heavily guarded facility. What the Gestapo failed to understand was that their very presence, their aggressive interrogations and thinly veiled threats, only strengthened the nuns' resolve. Each photograph of an executed resistor, each description of torture methods, each promise of violence served as a reminder of why the escape network existed in the first place. Sister Agnes, during one particularly brutal questioning session, was told in graphic detail what would happen to her if the agents discovered she had aided Eduard, and when she emerged from the interrogation room, she walked directly to Sister Marguerite and whispered that they should accelerate their plans for the next escape, not slow them down. The German response was having the exact opposite effect of what they intended, transforming women who might have been intimidated into silence into hardened conspirators willing to risk everything. The hospital staff watched as the Gestapo tore apart supply rooms and interviewed every delivery person who had access to the building, and in the chaos and distraction, the nuns began planning their next operation with even greater sophistication. The resistance sent word through Jean-Paul the baker that Eduard had reached the first safe house successfully, despite his injuries from the fall, and that within 48 hours he had been moved to a second location with a doctor who specialized in treating resistance fighters. The message, hidden again in a loaf of bread, included a request that stunned Sister Marguerite with its audacity. The resistance wanted to attempt 3 more escapes within the next 2 months, targeting specific high-value prisoners that the Gestapo was preparing to transfer to Germany for show trials. These were not random detainees, but key figures in the Belgian resistance network, people whose knowledge and connections made them invaluable to the cause and whose public trials would serve as Nazi propaganda victories. Michel's message was clear. The first escape had proven the concept. Now they needed to scale the operation while they still had the element of surprise. Sister Marguerite understood the logic even as it terrified her. Each successful escape would embolden the resistance and demoralize the occupiers. But each attempt also increased the statistical probability of discovery. The nuns adapted their methods based on lessons learned from Eduard's escape, refining their techniques and identifying weaknesses in the original plan. Sister Catherine developed a new rope design that incorporated wire stolen from medical equipment, creating hybrid cables that were significantly stronger than pure linen braids. Sister Marie mapped additional escape routes, identifying 3 different windows on various floors that offered access to different sections of the surrounding streets, allowing them to vary their approach and avoid establishing a predictable pattern. Sister Therese began cultivating relationships with specific guards, the ones who seemed less ideologically committed to the Nazi cause, offering them extra coffee or small kindnesses that might make them fractionally less vigilant at crucial moments. They were learning to think like intelligence operatives, to see the hospital not as a place of healing, but as a battlefield where every detail mattered and every advantage had to be exploited. The second escape was planned for 3 weeks after the first, targeting a resistance radio operator named Sophie Declercq, who had been arrested while transmitting Allied intelligence to London. The Gestapo considered her an intelligence goldmine, someone who potentially knew the locations of multiple resistance cells and the identities of dozens of operatives, and they had been interrogating her with increasing brutality for over a month. Sister Marguerite had been treating Sophie's injuries, chemical burns on her hands from the Gestapo's preferred torture method of holding fingers over open flames, and during these sessions, Sophie had quietly conveyed that she would never break, that she would die before betraying her network. The plan followed the same basic structure as Edouard's escape, but with critical modifications. They would use a different window on the third floor, the rope would be pre-positioned the night before to reduce last-minute activity, and the resistance extraction team would include a woman who could provide Sophie with a complete change of clothes and appearance immediately upon reaching the alley. Michel sent word that everything was in place, that safe houses were prepared, that forged papers identifying Sophie as a nurse from Ghent were ready. All they needed was the final confirmation from Sister Marguerite that Tuesday night the same shift change window would work. She sent back a single word, hidden in the hem of a pillowcase returned to Jean-Paul's laundry delivery. Yes. The machinery of resistance was in motion once again, and there would be no stopping it. Sophie de Klerk's escape unfolded with clockwork precision that seemed almost miraculous given the heightened security following Edouard's disappearance. The Gestapo had installed additional guards and implemented random patrol schedules designed to eliminate predictable patterns, but Sister Marie had spent weeks observing the new routines and discovered that chaos itself could be predictable. The guards, overworked and stretched thin across multiple duties, inevitably fell back into habits during the late evening hours when fatigue set in and vigilance deteriorated. The Tuesday night shift change remained the weakest point in the security apparatus, and at 10:14, exactly as planned, Sophie descended the reinforced rope from a third-floor window while Corporal Schneider sat in the guardroom drinking his coffee, completely unaware that history was repeating itself 3 floors above his head. The extraction went flawlessly, Sophie reaching the ground without incident, the resistance team spiriting her away into the Brussels night, and the nuns retrieving the rope and erasing all evidence within 90 seconds. The alarm did not sound until the following morning during breakfast rounds, giving Sophie a 10-hour head start that effectively guaranteed her escape. The Gestapo response to the second escape was apoplectic, a fury so intense it bordered on hysteria. The officer in charge of hospital security, a captain named Wolfgang Steiner, was relieved of duty and transferred to the Eastern Front, a punishment that everyone understood was tantamount to a death sentence. His replacement, a Gestapo major named Klaus Richter, arrived with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and a mandate to prevent any further escapes by whatever means necessary. Richter implemented a reign of terror that transformed the hospital into something resembling a prison camp, installing searchlights in the courtyard, welding shut windows on the upper floors, and ordering that prisoners be shackled to their beds at all times. He conducted mass interrogations of the entire staff, keeping people awake for 36 hours straight, while rotating teams of questioners broke them down psychologically. 3 Belgian orderlies were arrested on suspicion of collaboration and disappeared into Gestapo headquarters, never to be seen again. The message was unmistakable. The next escape would result in mass executions. Sister Marguerite knew they should stop, that the risk had become too great, that Richter's new security measures had eliminated most of their operational advantages. The rational decision was to shut down the escape network, destroy the remaining ropes, and return to passive resistance. But rationality collided with a moral imperative that could not be ignored. There were still 11 prisoners in the basement cells, 11 human beings waiting for execution or deportation to concentration camps, and the nuns had proven they could save them. How could they look into those cells each day, see the desperate hope in those faces, and choose to do nothing? Sister Marguerite called a secret meeting of her core conspirators in the chapel, expecting them to vote for suspension of operations, but instead found herself facing 6 women who had already made their decision. Sister Agnes spoke for all of them when she said that they had not become resistors to quit when things got difficult, that every day they did nothing was a day the Nazis won. They would continue. They would adapt to Richter's security measures. They would find new methods, new routes, new windows of opportunity, and they would save as many lives as God gave them the strength to save. The third and fourth escapes required innovations that pushed the nuns' ingenuity to its absolute limit. With most windows welded shut, they identified a coal chute in the basement that opened into a delivery area rarely patrolled by guards, and they spent 2 weeks secretly widening the chute opening, using tools stolen from the hospital maintenance shop. The rope system evolved as well, with Sister Catherine developing a pulley mechanism hidden in a ventilation shaft that allowed them to lower prisoners more quickly and with less physical strain. They recruited 2 additional nuns into the conspiracy, expanding their network despite the increased risk, because the operations now required more lookouts and coordinators. Over a span of 6 weeks in the spring of 1942, they freed 4 more prisoners, using the coal chute route, each escape executed with such precision that the Gestapo could not determine how it was being accomplished. Richter became obsessed with finding the leak, installing hidden cameras and conducting surprise inspections at random hours. But he was searching for a sophisticated spy network when the reality was far simpler and more audacious than he could imagine. The beginning of the end came not from German competence, but from simple exhaustion and the law of averages. Sister Catherine, who had been working 18-hour days maintaining the escape infrastructure, while also performing her regular nursing duties, made a critical error during the preparation for the 7th escape. She left a section of rope partially visible in the ventilation shaft, too tired to perform the usual meticulous concealment, and a maintenance worker spotted it during a routine inspection. The worker, a Belgian collaborator hoping to curry favor with the occupiers, reported the discovery immediately to Major Richter. The Gestapo set a trap, allowing the next escape attempt to proceed while agents waited in the delivery area below the coal chute. On a rainy Tuesday night in April of 1942, Sister Marguerite lowered a resistance fighter named Thomas Beaumont into the waiting arms of 6 Gestapo agents, and in that terrible moment realized that everything they had built was collapsing around them. The agents followed the rope back to its source, arrested Sister Catherine on the spot, and within an hour had rounded up every nun who had been part of the conspiracy. The hospital's age of quiet resistance had ended, and the age of retribution was about to begin. The trial of the 7 nuns was a farce designed to send a message, a public spectacle held in a Brussels courthouse where German military judges had already determined the verdict before a single witness testified. Sister Marguerite, Sister Agnes, Sister Catherine, Sister Therese, Sister Marie, and 2 others whose names the Gestapo had extracted through interrogation stood in the dock wearing their habits, their hands bound, facing charges of high treason, espionage, and crimes against the German Reich. The prosecutor presented the evidence with theatrical flourish, displaying the braided rope made from hospital linens, showing photographs of the coal chute and ventilation shafts, reading statements from the Belgian collaborator who had discovered the operation. He described the nuns not as women of God, but as dangerous subversives who had betrayed the trust placed in them, who had weaponized their positions of mercy to undermine German authority. The defense attorney, a Belgian lawyer assigned to the case, offered only the most perfunctory arguments, understanding that any vigorous defense would likely result in his own arrest. The verdict was announced after less than 2 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts, sentence of death by firing squad to be carried out within 48 hours. But something unexpected happened in those final 48 hours, something the Nazis had not anticipated. Word of the nuns' heroism spread through Brussels like wildfire, whispered in cafes and marketplaces, passed along resistance networks that stretched across occupied Belgium. The story of women who had stolen bedsheets to save lives, who had risked everything to defy the occupation, resonated with a population desperate for symbols of courage. The Catholic Church, which had largely remained neutral throughout the occupation to protect its institutions, could not ignore the impending execution of 7 nuns, and the Archbishop of Brussels sent an urgent telegram to Berlin requesting clemency. International pressure began to build, with the Vatican issuing a formal protest and Swiss newspapers running stories about the condemned women. The Gestapo found itself in an uncomfortable position, realizing that executing nuns would create martyrs and potentially galvanize resistance activity rather than suppress it. After frantic consultations with Berlin, Major Richter received orders to commute the death sentences, to deportation to Ravensbrück concentration camp in Germany, a compromise that satisfied no one but avoided the propaganda disaster of public executions. The 7 nuns were transported to Ravensbrück in cattle cars in May of 1942, joining thousands of other women deemed enemies of the Reich. The camp was a special kind of hell, a place where slow death through starvation and disease replaced the immediate violence of firing squads. Sister Marguerite and her fellow conspirators were separated upon arrival, assigned to different work details designed to break their spirits and their bodies. Sister Catherine died first, succumbing to typhus in the winter of 1943, her body cremated in the camp ovens without ceremony or record. Sister Agnes followed 6 months later, worked to death in the camp's armaments factory. Sister Therese survived until January of 1945, dying just weeks before the camp's liberation by Soviet forces. Of the 7 nuns arrested, only 3 survived to see the end of the war: Sister Marguerite, Sister Marie, and Sister Elizabeth, returning to a Belgium that was free but forever changed by 5 years of occupation. The story of the hospital bedsheet escapes could have ended there, buried in the chaos and trauma of post-war Europe. Just another footnote in the massive catalogue of resistance activities that had occurred across occupied territories. But Sister Marguerite, who lived until 1987, spent the last 4 decades of her life ensuring that the story was told and remembered. She wrote a detailed memoir documenting every escape, every rope, every terrifying moment of those 2 years when ordinary nuns became extraordinary resistors. She testified at war crimes trials, identifying Gestapo officers who had tortured prisoners in the hospital basement. She gave interviews to historians researching the Belgian resistance, always careful to emphasize that she and her sisters were not unique heroes, but simply people who had chosen to act when action was required. What haunted her most, she admitted in her final interview before her death, was not the time she spent in Ravensbrück or the sisters she lost, but rather the prisoners she could not save, the men and women who remained in the basement cells after the network was discovered and who were subsequently executed or deported. The legacy of the bedsheet escapes extends far beyond the 7 lives directly saved by the nuns' actions. The story became a touchstone in post-war Belgium, taught in schools as an example of moral courage under impossible circumstances, referenced in debates about resistance and collaboration, honored in memorials and museums dedicated to preserving the memory of occupation. In 1995, the Belgian government posthumously awarded medals to all 7 nuns, recognizing them officially as heroes of the resistance. A plaque was installed at the Saint-Pierre Hospital, which still operates today, commemorating the women who transformed instruments of healing into instruments of liberation. The deeper lesson, the one that Sister Marguerite insisted upon in every telling, was that resistance does not require special training or extraordinary capabilities. It requires only the willingness to see injustice and refuse to accept it, to use whatever tools and opportunities are available, and to act despite fear. 7 nuns with stolen bedsheets proved that even in the darkest moments of human history, when evil seems overwhelming and resistance appears futile, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. Their story survives not because it was unique, but because it reminds us that courage is always possible, that there is always something we can do, and that the choice to act or to remain silent is one we make every single day.